Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jerusalem Press Club's war briefing. Israelis woke up this morning to news of the deadliest day of fighting for their troops since the ground incursion into Gaza, with 21 soldiers killed in a single incident on Monday. A stark reminder that while the intensity of the war in the south might appear to have receded, with many reservists on extended furlough, the war is still very much ongoing. Both the northern and Gaza peripheries remain barren of their pre-October 7th populations, and tensions in the Red Sea are a further indication of regional instability. Joining us today to provide us insight on our 3.5-month mark is Israel's most recent national security advisor, Dr. Eyal Hulata, a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington. Thank you for joining us again, Dr. Hulata.
Thank you, Talia. Hello, everyone. Indeed, a difficult day. I think that the fact that the war has been waging for so long. Of course, there is always surprises in such a war. During the day here in Washington, several people told me that they were surprised that an event like this didn't happen before. I think this says a lot about the way that the IDF has been as professional as possible in maneuvering in such dense, urban, full of wreckage war zone to avoid incident like that. But at the end, it happened. It's really devastating. Reservists with families in a single day. It's a real a tragedy and shock for us. Okay, as always, I want to give you some flashlights on the main things I believe we need to watch for currently, and then we'll open it up to question. I'll devote as much time as I can to the things that are on your minds. On Gaza itself, a few things that I think are worth mentioning. First, on the front, on the south, it's difficult to know how close the IDF is to putting their hands on the leadership of Hamas. Clearly, that is the aim. We have to expect that Sinwar and Def are using not only Palestinians as human shields, but also the hostages as human shields, which will complicate the operational situation a lot. But that is an aim of the war, and we'll have to see if the IDF is capable to have the intel and the operational capacity to do that. Of course, on the south as well, the Rafah crossing, or the Philadelphia route, as we call it in Hebrew, close attention to that. The Egyptians have already said that any change in Israel's positioning on that front, they will see severely. I was very disappointed to see that, I have to say, because I think it is clear for the Egyptians that something needs to happen on that front. There were serious negotiations during our government, which I believe have also progressed, unfortunately, mostly only after the war started. It doesn't matter, but we need to have a new setting of the verification of the goods that are going in Rafah crossing, and of course a better treatment of the tunnels underground there. The capacity of equipment that Hamas was able to smuggle in is huge. I think we know now even more than we did before about the quantities of that apparatus, and making sure that no one can replenish arms in the Gaza Strip will be a cornerstone of the ability to put an end to this war. Otherwise, they will replenish again. I mean, we see now what they were able to do in a little bit more than 2 years since Guardian of the Walls, the amount of rockets specifically, and all of the equipment they needed for the tunnels. This cannot continue this way. So that's the second thing to look at the south. Of course, in the north of Gaza and also in the center of Gaza, We hear more, unfortunately, that there is recovery of insurgency in those areas, both armed and posing threats on the IDF, but also I think on the day-to-day lives. I'm hearing more and more that Hamas is now doing policing in northern Gaza and governing trade. That's a very bad outcome. I've been critical before in these meetings about the lack of planning of a day after strategy. I think after 100 days, we will see this more and more. If the government of Israel is not capable of making decisions that would create an alternative, there is no vacuums and ever, and especially not in this difficult circumstances. And if we do not build a new alternative that can civilianly govern Gaza, then the two other options will either be that the IDF will continue to do that, and this is not Israel's policy, as you can see. I mean, IDF is moving out, but if the IDF is moving out and there is no other civilian pragmatic arrangement, then we shouldn't be surprised that Hamas is capable of regaining positioning, and that's very worrisome to me. I think it should be worried to everybody. And I'm not sure what the government is doing with this, but that's a big problem to look into. Gaza,
Can that happen
looking
though
ahead.
in the middle of the war to bring in an alternative civilian governing body? I mean,
Well,
it
I think
seems natural that if Hamas is there, they're going
yeah.
to be the ones that.
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that because there is no meaningful process about what will happen after the war ends, then there are no arrangements of other sorts. So if we don't know what will happen in a month, then we don't know what will happen now. What should have been created is an overall strategy that when the IDF pulls out, because as we say, we've been able to secure this region, there will be some kind of alternative there. There are many ideas that have been floated. There have been many ideas that were presented to the cabinet and to the government about this. Of course, no decision was made. But not dealing with it at all, of course, creates the perfect conditions for Hamas to resurrect, and we will see counterinsurgency. That's very problematic over time. Those are the issues for Gaza. And again, if you have questions, I'd be happy to address. On the north, of course, we need to keep a close eye on what's happening there. Israel has been, I think, increasing its intensity, especially because of an increased Iranian attempts to leverage this situation. Israel does not take credit for things, but the outcomes I think are there, both in Syria and in Lebanon. We need to keep a close eye on this. I think it is clear that it is not in the interest of Nasrallah to open a war, and his attacks on Israel, his focus on military targets and not on civilian targets. Of course, most of that is because there are almost no civilians at all on the northern border. But from time to time, we do see shootings on houses and injury, and also casualties from time to time. I hope this does not escalate into an open war while we are focusing on the south. But as I've said before, Israel will not be able to leave the Lebanese border in this kind of status quo over time. If 1701 cannot be re-implemented and verified and secured in a way that Hezbollah cannot be on our border, then it's just a matter of time until Israel will need to act on this, and we need to see how this continues. As it comes to the West Bank, of course, it can erupt in any moment. I think the last week or so signifies the intensity of what the IDF is doing. I think in a very surgical and meaningful way, but of course, things can get out of hand easily. Those are the Israeli center worries. As it comes to the Red Sea, I think the intensity of the American and the British bombing campaigns in Yemen, I hope will soon also provide results. It doesn't seem that the Houthis have been intimidated just because the Americans started using force. Over time, we'll need to see how that plays out. Of course, Iran is behind all of this. If they want this to stop, it will stop. If they don't, it won't. I think what's interesting is we're seeing more and more indications and more even Iranian statements that ensure that everybody can see, because they're not shying away from that, about their direct responsibility in what's happening in the Red Sea, attacks that they've been conducting by themselves closer to India, and their support to the Houthis and threats to the United States. That's a big deal. I can tell you also here in Washington, I don't want to talk about American policy in this regard, but that's definitely something to cover as we look at the various issues on Iran. And of course, in the midst of all of this are two important things that are dealt with, I will say, diplomatically, and we need to see how they will play out. The hostages continue to be a corner piece of not only sorrow, I think, of increasing um, um, uh, tension and eventually clear criticism that is growing in numbers, and that will be also public on the streets from week by week on the government. You've seen more of this over the last weekend, more than you've seen on the weekend before, and I think we should all expect to see more of that as we move ahead. It's been 109 days now. Talia, am I counting? 108 or 109? I've met here in Washington families last week. They met the administration. They had very important meetings on this to get answers from the United States, but clearly the main government that needs to address this and to make the decisions related to that is the Israeli government. We hear things about a deal that has been negotiated, and also a report that Hamas has rejected the Israeli proposal that was put in front of them. Of course, there is more in the dark than in the light on this, but this isn't going to be an easy negotiation moving ahead, and we will see, I think, more pressure by the families and the government in this regard. And lastly, just to put it out there, it's not, the scope of those we're talking about the war, but everything is connected to everything. You also see more and more reportings about progress being made between the Saudis, Israel, the US, about a potential normalization. Everything has to do with everything, right? It has to do with how the war ends. It has to do with the Saudi role in the day after, with the Palestinians in general, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And this, I think, positioning puts us in a setting where I think the next few weeks and few months will be very formative. We will see if how these boxes are put together and what could be the outcomes. There are several optimistic scenarios, of course. I can present also very pessimistic scenarios to all of this. But those are the materials that, of course, we all need to cover and see how they evolve. In general, I think all of you are in Israel from some period of time. I was in Israel a few weeks ago, and I think that the mood is very tense. The sense of unity is still very strong. I think the amount of sense of purpose still, I think, across the society is high. The morale in the military is very high. I hear this from friends, from reservists who leave. Of course, you hear all sorts of stories, but I think by and large, Israel is still very strong in this mindset of joint need to be strong and united and cohesive to address those threats. And I believe this will carry us ahead throughout the time. This is a very important strength the Jewish people has, Israel in particular, and we're going to need that to tackle the challenges ahead of us.
Absolutely.
Okay, Talia, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the opening. There's a lot to pick apart there, so I think just to make it easiest for everybody, we'll start from the end. You mentioned you finished with the issue of with other regional players that might be part of this day after plan or whatever it ends up being. And you said that there are pessimistic scenarios and optimistic scenarios. So for the sake of time, can you focus maybe on the most likely scenario, most realistic scenario as
Yeah. Well, I think the most realistic scenario is that those attempts, which have, I think, they're based on very strong foundations, right? I mean, the interests of the countries are very clear towards normalization, towards stability of all the countries. I think the main problem is the Israeli politics. I think this current Israeli government is incapable of making any of the decisions needed to allow for this to happen. Um, um, I have a good idea of what are the things that would probably be demanded from Netanyahu on the Palestinian aspects of such a deal. He cannot approve any of this with his current government, and he has no intention of creating a new one and putting the far right factions of the government outside of the coalition. So I think we're basically in a dead end in the immediate time frame. It doesn't mean that this won't progress. I mean, we're talking about very skillful politicians. They can continue to negotiate for weeks and for months, and time will pass on this. Eventually, I would expect that we'll still won't be able to have any kind of meaningful agreements with this composition of a government, and this would eventually probably lead to a change in Israeli government. But as long as Bibi has a majority of members of Knesset, he's in power. We're a democracy. That's the way it is. And clearly, this is a very important piece of his strategy looking ahead, how to keep all this intact. He wouldn't want to both not have a deal and lose his government from his perspective. But if I need to, as you say, Talia, what's the realistic scenario? I think we'll see a lot of talk, a lot of discussions, but an inability to reach a deal in the near future. That's my belief at the moment.
Okay, fair enough. And perhaps if we have a little bit more time towards the end, we might pick apart the political situation as well. I will focus on the questions that are coming in about the military issues, security, more specifically. You spoke yourself about the reports of the deal, hostage deal, ceasefire deal that we're hearing. If you can comment on that and whether there is whether there might be any truth in it, but also B, how this might play into the larger strategy of what we end up doing if we can bounce back from a deal afterwards and continue operating in Gaza.
Yeah. So I cannot shed light on the deal and the details because I don't know about it. I'm not in the weeds of those deliberations. But I will share, my perspective on some of this. First, and I think you've heard me say this before, Israel is not using all of the levers it can use to press Hamas in this. I think the Qatari angle is dealt with soft gloves, and if there's no pressure on Sinwar from the Hamas outside of Gaza, and there's also an argument to be put that even if they would have put pressure on him, maybe he wouldn't change his calculus. But the fact that this pressure isn't there clearly doesn't help us, and this comes from the position of Qatar. They view themselves as the enabling of this negotiation, where I think it would have helped a lot if they're held accountable also for their role in creating the conditions for that. And that has to be a decision made by the Israeli government, has to be backed by the American administration. But this starts from Israel. If the prime minister isn't willing to do this, then we won't have this lever. So we're left only with the military pressure, which, as I said before, as long as Sinwar feels that he's not in arm's reach from the IDF, then time plays on his side. The international media, Israel is losing points every week. In the society of Israel, Israel is he perceived this as weakness every week. So why would he give away concessions if he doesn't have to. So I'm not surprised. Again, if the publications are right, I'm not surprised that he rejected this proposition. It's clear what he wants. He doesn't want just a ceasefire. He wants the war to end. He wants immunity. He wants the ability to continue to rule Gaza without being afraid that he will be attacked. And as I think other Hamas leaders have said, they want assurances from the international community. Of course, they want all of the prisoners released. That's a set of things that Israel shouldn't give. I'm saying this as my basic position. I think Israel needs to exert more types of pressure to create conditions of a new deal for this to happen, because we do need to get the hostages out. I'm not as worried about the implications of a ceasefire or another ceasefire, even if it's extended. Israel should not commit not to continue its campaigns in Gaza. It just doesn't have to be in this kind of war, and there are many ways to do this after this ends. Will high intensity war continue after 2 months of a ceasefire? Difficult to say. I have to say to you, I mean, you, for those of you who've been hearing me for the duration of this time, I'm surprised that Israel was given the conditions to continue this war so long in this high of intensity anyway. And I think this is very important. This calls a lot about the international support that we're getting from the Americans, from the Brits, from Western Europe. But eventually, this time frame will end. This kind of balance that we need to strike as it comes to the hostages.
When you talk about stepping up the use of any kinds of something that might convince them to enter a deal, does this also include maybe a change to Israel's policy on humanitarian things going into Gaza, or is this not a consideration?
I don't think Hamas cares about it. I think this is not in the interest of Hamas. I mean, of course, they talk about this because it helps them put us in a bad situation, but this does not change the calculus of Sinwar. Sinwar is, I think, only focused on his survivability and the ability of Hamas to retain control over Gaza. The humanitarian situation, of course, is a problem. It will increasingly be a problem, and Israel will need to address this, and the international community will need to address this. But I don't think this affects the calculus of Sinwar. Unfortunately, if he cared about his people, we might have not been in this situation. But I don't think he cares about that.
Okay. Some journalists are asking specifically about yesterday's incident. One is saying that Hamas took its time to claim responsibility for the attack itself. Why is this, given that they're the ones responsible there, and usually it's something, there's glory in taking responsibility for killing Israeli soldiers?
It's a good question. I have to say, I don't know. I cannot answer that. There are many speculations, and as in such cases, the social media is filled with stories and ideas. But I cannot relate to that. I don't know what is the reason for that.
And is there something that the military is now going to learn from this specific incident in terms of its tactics in the field?
I'd assume. I mean, again, this is this dreadful incident. Unfortunately, as I see from what has been reported, was caused by an RPG or some other kind of anti-tank missile that probably directly hit one of the explosive that were intended to collapse that house. Unfortunately, sometimes all you need is luck, and I guess this is one of those cases where the guy shooting that RPG, I don't think anticipated this result when he shot it. I'm sure that there are lessons to be made of how to protect the soldiers, how to protect the explosives, how to create a more secure environment before they conduct something like this. And I'm sure the IDF will learn the most out of this. At the end of the day, this is a very dense area, and there are threats anywhere. The IDF knows that we haven't been able to eliminate all of the terrorists and their ability to put threat on us. There have been many instances where close encounter, almost face to face between insurgents and soldiers have saved us from catastrophes over the last weeks. There are many stories like this. But I'm sure that there are tactical lessons, and I'm confident that the IDF will learn them and improve as they can. But the outcome is what's done is done. We have 21 fallen in very bad circumstances.
Of course, and we usually hear about what's actually happened and not what's been avoided. So that's of course something to take into consideration. You mentioned earlier that Nasrallah doesn't have an interest in an all-out war with Israel, but at the same time, Israelis aren't returning to their homes, and 1701 still hasn't been implemented, and Israel might not be able to just sit and wait without taking preemptive action. Do you think that without a 10-7 in the north, will Israel have the international credit to take military action in the north?
So, I've addressed this before, and I'll be as sharp as I said before. If there was a 10-7 in the north, the amount of casualties would have been much larger than the one around Gaza, just because of the density of the population. I don't think a 10-7 can happen in Lebanon after it happened in Gaza. The IDF will be able to secure the border way better than that, so it's not hypothetical. But I also said before, and I believe that, and I tell this in all of my meetings here, and I think it's very important that everybody understands, regardless of who will be in power in Israel, Israel does not need another justification in order to be active in Lebanon. I think October 7 was enough proof of what can happen when we allow the ability of our enemies who are sworn to destroy us to be able to surprise us. We will not be able to do this again. It doesn't mean that we need to attack Lebanon now. I'm in favor of allowing the international community to try to enforce 1701 in a better, meaningful way than they did. I don't have high hopes of the ability to do that, unfortunately. And if that doesn't happen, Israel will need to act, and Israel will not wait for an event like this. We'll need to act when it's appropriate, when we're ready, and not wait for another justification. I think this needs to be very, very clear all around. Now is the time to see that diplomacy can prevent wars. And if that is the case, great. And if not, unfortunately, then I guess we will need to engage.
One journalist is asking about the reports that the International Court of Justice might be nearing to some kind of ruling over over South Africa's case against Israel.
Yeah.
Do you believe that if this ruling is made while we're still at war, it will have any impact on the cabinet's next moves, or will it be in an empty vacuum being heard?
Look, again, I think that in general, and regardless of a composition of the government, the accusation that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide is so outrageous and so completely political and unjustified that I think it doesn't really matter what's the composition of the government of Israel. I don't believe that this will be the ruling of the International Court of Justice. Because it's just so wrong. If God forbid this is the ruling, being so political, unfortunately, this will be another indication of how politicized all of the international organizations have been. And the ICJ was considered to be less politicized than others, like the ICC that was created later to that. I'll be very surprised if this will be their ruling. Of course, I don't expect them not to criticize Israel, and we'll need to see how that works out afterwards. But no one should expect such an outrageous ruling and then this affecting Israel's positioning. We have support of all of. I mean, I don't know who's in front of me. I've met several of you before, but the governments of probably all of your national nations have backed Israel on this. the US, UK, France, Germany. I mean, it's quite wide that just preposterous to claim that Israel is conducting genocide in Gaza. So we'll need to wait and see what is the ruling will be. But I would first again, it is my expectation this will not be the case.
But could it have some sort of impact on public opinion? I mean, maybe not the diplomats, the decision makers, the governments, but at the end of the day, these are slogans that are being heard by the public, and could that harm Israel?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're heard by the public now, even before the ICJ. I live in the United States. I live in Washington. I see what's happening here in campuses. Even if in my son's high school, I have to say, unfortunately, and of course elsewhere, the pro-Palestinian voters don't wait for a ruling to say that Israel is conducting genocide, and they don't stop chanting that Palestine needs to be free from the river to the sea, which is actually saying that Israel needs not to exist in the region. I don't think that this will change that. It might change the volume. It might create more exposure to that. And again, hopefully this will not be the case. But I mean, Israel is already, unfortunately, operating under pressure of international public opinion that is, I think, completely unjustified and uneducated, fueled by interessants who just defy the right of Israel to exist, and some of them also anti-Semitic on the Jewish people in general. We need to face that anyway. And I'm very happy to say that while we do this, we do get support from the governments. We do get support from a lot of the establishments and a lot of the organizations. Israel is not only facing criticism, and that's very important, because those who are aware of history, and those who are aware of the conditions on the ground, those who are aware of the chain of events in Gaza in general, and that are completely aware of the horrific, unprecedented magnitude of brutality that caused on October 7, understand that Israel's right to protect itself means and entails, unfortunately, what we're seeing in Gaza. And as long as we get that support, that's important. We will need to deal with public opinion. I'm very worried about this. I'm very worried that the young generation across the board in the US and elsewhere have no empathy for Israel's right to exist, and for the importance of a nation state for the Jewish people. People just forgot their history so quickly and don't understand the importance of that. Apart from the fact that they might have a criticism of Israel's policy from this government or another, but this is not what we're facing. We're facing a challenge of Israel's right to exist as an independent country here in the region, and this is something that we'll need to address continuously, all the time, and especially after the war is over.
I'll just leave you with one last question that recurs in almost every one of our conversations, and you already hinted in the past, and I'm wondering if anything has changed. Journalists are asking about the role of the PA because it's something that often decision makers comment over, and if you have any opinion over whether there's a place for the PA in the future Gaza.
Look, I mean, the trivial answer has to be that if Israel doesn't want to govern Gaza, then there will need to be self-governance in Gaza by the Palestinians. But my stand is that the PA has no capacity, nor does it have any legitimacy to be able to do that. In Gaza, for sure, and I think that it's losing its capacity and legitimacy to also do this in the West Bank. I don't think that a reform in the PA will solve anything. I think that there is a lot of soul searching among the Palestinians themselves to be done if they ever want any kind of process or meaningful future with Israel. What will they do? This PA has been granted, Abu Mazen specifically has been granted several times propositions that could end the conflict in ways that should have been sufficient for him, and he refused. 2008 and later on also during Netanyahu years in negotiation that have not been fully disclosed, but I think all of you know that they were there. This famous story that Obama told Abu Mazen, "Here's the deal," and Abu Mazen said, "I'll get back to you," and never did. So I mean, and this is just on the political sphere. Of course, on the ground, the level of corruption, the inability to govern and to give future to the people, to support moves that I think should have been supported to improve the economic situation of the West Bank during the previous government when I was National Security Advisor. If the PA is incapable of doing all of this, and if incapable of supporting the lives of the Palestinians, that's a Palestinian problem. Of course, this entails a problem for us. I would very much want to see an entity that is willing to engage, that we can promote this. And definitely there will need to be some kind of pragmatic self uh, 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 ruling of Palestinians, of Gazans in Gaza for this to move ahead. This goes back to what I said in the beginning of this. Unfortunately, if our government isn't willing to do any of that and talk about any option, and the only thing that Netanyahu is able to say is no, 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 then of course there is no ability to create any conditions. So this question, of course, is important, but I think at this point in time, this is not the most important thing. What the most important thing is, are we able to create conditions for any kind of civilian governance in Gaza? Even if I don't think that it should be the PA, but any other movement will need to be supported by the Israeli government. Unfortunately, this government of Israel isn't able to support any of the various options and to work constructively with any of the Arab countries around us, not with Egypt, not with, I think also not with Saudi Arabia and others, to create those conditions. That is the problem that worries me now.
I promised it was the last question, but one came in, which it's difficult to ignore. You had mentioned obviously the need to prevent arms buildup in Gaza, because at the end of the day, even if it's not Hamas, their chances are that there will still be those with the desire to attack Israel down the line.
Yeah.
And in addition to the surprise we experienced with the buildup of weapons over the last 2 years, of course, we have the whole tunnel issue. Now that the know-how exists, with this incredible network that was created literally underneath our feet, and all these these ideas for technologies and ways of getting rid of the tunnels, whether it was flooding them, and now there's talk of an engineer saying maybe we can create tunnels to get rid of the tunnels. Not really sure how that's supposed to work. Is there a way to prevent an entire new system being built, even if it's going to take another few years, now that has proven to be so effective?
So first, I'm sure that there are things that will be developed over time. Unfortunately, we didn't use the time we had before the war to prepare these kind of solutions. But Israelis are very inventive. I'm sure we'll find things to do. But I do want to focus on the aspect relating to replenishment, Talia, that you occurred to. Those are two separate issues. The tunneling under the cities and towns in Gaza, which we need to address only when we get into Gaza, and I hope we won't need to get into Gaza again with military if we play it right. That's one problem. The second problem is the tunnels that go across borders. At least for now, and hopefully this will be the case in the future, the underground wall that we've built along our borders prevented Hamas from being able to dig tunnels that would go into Israel. So we know of at least one solution to tunnels between Rafah, from Gaza to Rafah, from Egypt, if we work constructively with the Egyptians to prevent that from happening. This will need to start with first understanding the amount of tunnels that are there. This has to be with a collaboration with the Egyptians. And as I said before, I'm very worried to hear the rhetoric by the Egyptians. It seems like, at least overtly, they have no intention of working with Israel on this front. Hopefully, behind the scenes, has happened before, because we had very constructive dialogues with the Egyptians when I was National Security Advisor on a host of things, including this issue. There's a lot to be done between Israel and Egypt on this. I strongly believe that this is not in the government of Egypt's interest to have Gaza replenished. I don't think that President Sisi wants this. I don't think that the higher ranks of the military in Egypt wants this. Clearly, there was local collaboration. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened, of smugglers from both sides of the borders. But I do not put myself in suggesting or accusing the Egyptians for colluding with Hamas over this. I don't think this is the case. I don't think this is what the way we need to look at it. But we need to collaborate with the Egyptians to solve this moving ahead. And there are ways to do this, both underground and above the ground. We know how to secure shipments that are go through crossing in Erez and Kerem Shalom because we have equipment that is able to detect things that shouldn't go in. We could do this in Rafah. And we've proven that we can prevent tunnels to be dug underground. This can also be incorporated along the crossing. There are many things that could be done, but again, this has to be in a diplomatic engagement between the Israeli government and with Egypt. And unfortunately, I don't see this happening, and I'm not sure that this is possible with this government.
Dr. Eyal Hulata, I hope that our next conversation will be on a more positive note.
I hope so too.
Hard to tell at this point, but thank you so much for your time again. We appreciate your insight this week and every week.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everybody.